Black maid speaks Dutch in luxury hotel. Billionaire overhears and demands to see her immediately. What if a single phone call spoken in Dutch shattered years of silence? What if the hotel maid everyone ignored turned out to be the key to saving a $1 billion empire? This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about a brilliant black woman buried beneath uniforms and overlooked resumes, until one moment changed everything. Stay with this story, because the truth that's about to unfold will shake everything you thought you knew. Black maid answers call in Dutch. Billionaire freezes mid-step. The floor of the Grand Plaza Hotel gleamed like still water under the morning sun. Every tile was polished to perfection, a mirror of quiet elegance reflecting the lives of those who walked across it. Hurried guests in tailored suits, women in silk dresses clicking heels across imported marble. And then there was Zoe. In her plain gray housekeeping uniform, Zoe Johnson knelt by the corner of the grand lobby, wiping away invisible dust. She moved with the careful rhythm of someone who knew how not to be noticed. 6 years in this place had taught her how to disappear in plain sight. But that morning, something pierced the hush of luxury. A cell phone buzzed from her apron pocket. Her heart jumped. It was the number, University of Amsterdam. She hesitated. Rule number 1 from Manager Richards: no phones during shift, especially not in the lobby. But this was different. 6 scholarship rejections, 6 years of rejection letters, and now a callback. She ducked behind the marble column, her voice a whisper. Zoe Johnson speaking. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a crisp male voice answered in perfect Dutch. Zoe straightened slightly, her eyes widening. Goedemorgen, Professor. Ik ben zo blij u te horen. Her words flowed like silk, effortless and clear. Native-level Dutch, sharp, confident, melodic. The janitor, the invisible woman with the mop in hand, was suddenly holding a conversation in a language most people in that lobby wouldn't even recognize. They spoke for just under a minute. Zoe explained in flawless Dutch that her letter of motivation had been delayed in the mail, but she had already resent it. Her tone remained respectful, her accent impeccable. Then, silence. Zoe turned slowly. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The bustling lobby seemed to have paused, or perhaps it was just one man watching her. Standing just 10 feet away, Richard Coleman, billionaire CEO and owner of the entire Grand Plaza chain, stared at her. He wasn't frowning, he wasn't smiling either, just watching, curiously, intensely. Next to him stood manager Sarah Richards, her mouth tight, eyes simmering with disbelief. Zoe felt the color drain from her face. I must go, Professor. Ik bel u later, terug. She ended the call quickly, tucking the phone away like it was a weapon. Before she could take a step, Richards' voice cut through the lobby like a cold wind. Johnson, my office, now. The back hallways of the Grand Plaza felt colder than usual as Zoe followed Richards toward the basement administrative office. She could feel the stares of her coworkers. Some looked away quickly. Others didn't bother hiding their smirks. In a place like this, when someone like her stepped out of the box, even by speaking Dutch, it made people uncomfortable. Inside the office, Richards closed the door with a heavy snap. You know the rules, Johnson. No phones on shift. Especially not in guest areas. Zoe kept her tone calm. I understand, ma'am, but that was the university. Richards cut her off, her words sharp. And what was that language you were speaking? French? Dutch, Zoe corrected instinctively. Bad idea. I don't care if it was Klingon. What I care about is a cleaning lady standing in my lobby, chatting away in whatever foreign tongue, while Mr. Coleman, the owner, watches her slack off. Richard's voice rose with every word, her face flushed with something more than anger. It was resentment, deep, festering resentment. Zoe stood still, hands folded in front of her. The white receptionists took personal calls almost daily. She had seen them laugh and chat with friends, answer their children's schools, even browse Instagram behind the desk. But none of them ever got called downstairs. None of them ever got reassigned. You're going to the convention center bathrooms. Starting today, 3 months. No overtime. Zoe blinked. That meant back-to-back events, late-night cleanups, double workload, a punishment. One reserved for the disobedient or the too visible. Yes, ma'am, be grateful you're not being fired. Zoe left the office with her head high but her chest aching. Outside in the dim hallway, she paused by the break room door, letting her breath steady. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye, dark skin, tired eyes, hair tucked back under her cap. And yet, somewhere in that reflection, was a woman who could speak 6 languages, including Mandarin and Italian. A woman with an honors degree from Georgetown. A woman who had been rejected 47 times for internal positions, always with the same vague reply. Not the right fit. The next 12 hours passed in silence. Zoe scrubbed, wiped, disinfected not just floors, but the hurt crawling under her skin. That night in her cramped apartment with peeling paint and too thin walls, she cried. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired. Tired of being unseen. Tired of hiding her brilliance behind a mop bucket. What she didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that upstairs in a quiet executive suite, Richard Coleman was replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The woman on the phone in the lobby hadn't just been speaking Dutch. She had been breaking a silence that had hung over his hotel empire for far too long. For 6 years, a black linguist cleaned floors while talent was ignored. Zoe's alarm went off at 4:45 a.m. sharp, same as it had for the past 6 years. The buzz echoed through her dim apartment like a cold reminder. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes in the dark, careful not to wake the 2 nurses she shared the space with. The walls were paper thin, the ceilings cracked, and the window barely sealed out the sound of sirens 2 blocks over. She wrapped her Georgetown University sweatshirt tighter around her shoulders. The fabric had faded, the letters peeling, but it still held weight. It reminded her of who she was before the silence swallowed her. Zoe had graduated near the top of her class in linguistics. Honors student. Fluent in 6 languages. Her professors used to call her the code switcher, not just because of her mastery of dialects, but because of how effortlessly she moved between cultures. She dreamed of working in international diplomacy, of building bridges across borders and conflict zones. She dreamed big, but reality had its own language, and it spoke in closed doors. The first application she submitted to the Grand Plaza's corporate division came just weeks after graduation. Then another, and another. By the 3rd rejection, the responses had stopped including her name. Thank you for applying. We regret to inform you. By the 12th, she stopped counting, but only for a while. Eventually, the number became a form of record, 47 internal applications, 12 direct emails to department heads, 3 attempts to meet in person, all ignored. Every time she asked the front desk manager for feedback, she was told the same thing. Maybe you're not the right cultural fit for the role. Zoe knew what that meant. She knew exactly what they were too polite or too cowardly to say. Still, she refused to let bitterness rot her core. Each night after her shift, she came home, made tea, and opened her language textbooks. Mandarin by Monday. Dutch on Tuesday. Arabic on Thursday nights when the city felt loneliest. She whispered vocabulary to herself while folding sheets, practiced pronunciation while mopping ballroom floors. It was during these nights that her apartment transformed into something more than a space of survival. It became a classroom, a war room, A sanctuary, the place where she reminded herself of who she was even when the world tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't passive in her world. It was active, intentional. There was the time she watched a junior receptionist get promoted to guest services after just 5 weeks. The girl didn't speak a word of Mandarin, but had a father on the hotel's golf club board. There was the assistant manager, always fumbling with translation apps when international guests needed help, who had once chuckled and said, "You're too smart to be pushing carts, Zoe. Maybe you intimidate people." That kind of smile, she'd learned, always came before another door closed. But she never stopped showing up. Always early, always silent, always professional. She kept her posture straight, her eyes kind, and her dreams folded neatly in her chest pocket. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone had started paying attention. Richard Coleman was not a man easily impressed. At 45, he had turned bankrupt properties into gold mines, transforming fading hotels into 5-star resorts across the country. His instincts were sharp, his tolerance for incompetence near zero. But what made Coleman different from other billionaires wasn't just his business sense. It was his suspicion. 3 months before that morning in the lobby, he had begun noticing strange patterns in his East Coast properties. High turnover among staff of color, promotion charts that skewed toward white employees with lower experience levels, guest complaints about poor translation services during international events, despite massive budgets allocated for them. He asked his board for answers. They gave him polished spreadsheets. He didn't buy them. So he hired an independent consulting firm, quietly, discreetly. He told them to look at hiring practices, internal transfers, and department promotions. What they found made his stomach turn. Departments were gate-kept. Transfers from housekeeping to administration were consistently blocked. Bilingual staff were passed over in favor of monolingual managers with social ties. In nearly every hotel, HR records showed an alarming trend. Qualified black and brown employees stagnated in entry-level roles, regardless of performance or credentials. But it wasn't until he walked through the Grand Plaza lobby and heard a housekeeper speaking Dutch, fluent, native, precise Dutch, that everything crystallized. That wasn't just a smart woman on the phone. That was his missing proof. He watched as Zoe hung up, then watched as Richard stormed across the floor to punish her, not praise her. Coleman didn't speak. Not yet. But in that moment he made a decision. The truth was already there. He just needed to bring it to the surface. Back in her apartment, Zoe hung her Georgetown degree back on the wall. It had fallen last week after a neighbor slammed the hallway door. She looked at it for a long time, fingers brushing the cracked frame. One day she whispered, not as a hope, as a promise. Black Maid summoned to CEO's office and offered $5,000 a week. The next morning, the front desk phone rang just as Zoe finished polishing the glass doors of the main entrance. Jennifer, the head receptionist, peeked around the counter. "Zoe Johnson, Human Resources wants to see you right away." The sentence floated in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. HR didn't summon cleaning staff unless someone was being fired. Zoe's hands froze on the doorframe. She glanced down at her worn sneakers and wiped her palms on her apron. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like rising into a world she was never meant to see. The walls shimmered with gold trim. Her reflection stared back at her, anxious, poised, and still dressed in gray polyester. The HR director greeted her with a clipped tone. "Please have a seat." Zoe sat, her back straight, fingers folded tightly in her lap. "Mr. Coleman has requested a meeting with you. He's waiting." The words didn't register at first. She blinked slowly. "Richard Coleman? Yes, now." She stepped into his office like someone entering sacred ground. It was twice the size of her apartment, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in soft morning light. Behind a sleek walnut desk sat Richard Coleman, reading from an open folder. He didn't look up immediately, just said, "Dutch, French, Mandarin, Italian, Korean, Spanish, that correct?" Zoe's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." He turned the page slowly. Honors degree from Georgetown, departmental award in applied linguistics, and 6 years cleaning floors in my hotel. Zoe's breath caught in her chest. "I didn't know you knew who I was." He looked up at her now, eyes sharp but unreadable. "I didn't. Not until yesterday." He set the folder down, crossed his arms. "Tell me, Ms. Johnson, why does someone with your resume clean bathrooms instead of managing international relations?" Zoe hesitated, but only for a moment. "I applied 47 times, internal transfers, entry-level positions. I followed every policy. I was never called back. By whom? Manager Richards, Director Whitmore." Coleman didn't flinch. He just wrote their names down in a leather-bound notebook and closed it quietly. "Curious. Mr. Whitmore constantly complains about the lack of multilingual staff during our global events, especially for the Asian conferences." His voice dropped. "But yesterday I watched a woman in a cleaning uniform speak fluent Dutch, with nuance, tone, and cultural precision, while my senior management stood around fumbling with translation apps." Zoe's heart raced. This wasn't a lecture, it was an interview, a test. "Sir, if you're asking whether I'm qualified, my file speaks for itself. If you're asking why I was ignored, you'd have to ask the people who buried it." He smiled slightly. "That's fair." He stood, walked slowly to the window, then turned back to face her. "Tomorrow, a global trade conference begins in this building. Executives from Amsterdam and Shanghai. We're short-staffed. And I need someone who speaks both languages, understands cultural context, and can represent this brand." Zoe blinked. "You want me to clean their rooms?" He laughed, a deep sound that startled her. "No, Ms. Johnson. I want you to coordinate the entire international segment of the event. Temporarily for now. Salary starts at $5,000 a week, effective immediately." Her throat closed. $5,000 a week. That was more than 3 months' pay. That was impossible. "Why me?" "Because I heard you speak Dutch like a native. Because your file is stronger than anyone they've handed me in 6 years. And because I suspect something very wrong is happening inside this company, and I need someone who knows how to read between the lines." For a long moment, Zoe said nothing. Her mind raced with memories of rejection emails, of managers brushing past her like she was a wall, of long nights studying while her friends traveled the world doing the very job she dreamed of. She stood slowly. "Then I accept." 1 hour later, Zoe walked back through the lobby, but not in uniform, not with cleaning gloves in hand. She wore a navy blue blazer borrowed from HR and a new badge around her neck. International Relations Coordinator. Staff and guests turned to stare. She met every gaze head-on. Manager Richards spotted her near the elevators and narrowed her eyes. "Johnson, what are you doing up here without your uniform?" Zoe replied evenly. "Working, at the request of Mr. Coleman." She held up her badge. Richards paled. "Impossible. You're not qualified. Georgetown. Fluent in 6 languages. Resume. Been in the system for 6 years." She didn't wait for a reply. Zoe rode the elevator up to her new office, the city skyline unfolding around her. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt full. She wasn't invisible anymore. And the people who had kept her in the shadows, they were about to find out just how dangerous brilliance can be when it's finally seen. Black woman quietly fixes a crisis that could have cost millions. The executive conference room shimmered in sterile perfection. polished glass walls, white orchids in vases, silver trays holding bottled water imported from Iceland. But under the polished surface, danger was hiding in plain sight. Zoe sat alone in the VIP preparation suite, documents spread before her like puzzle pieces. A thick binder of translated material sat open on the table, filled with welcome letters, contract drafts, and corporate mission statements, all supposedly ready for the arrival of the Dutch and Chinese delegates the next morning. But something felt wrong. She flipped to the Mandarin translation of the keynote address and stared at a single phrase, then another, then the entire paragraph. Her stomach tightened. The phrasing wasn't just off, it was dangerous. The original line was supposed to welcome the Chinese executives with respect and formality, but the translation implied condescension. One sentence, if delivered as written, could easily be interpreted as an insult to their entire delegation. Zoe whispered the translation out loud, frowning. This isn't just poor wording. This is someone who knows vocabulary but not culture. She grabbed a pen and began rewriting, adjusting tone, reordering clauses, smoothing over idioms that would otherwise offend. Hours passed unnoticed as she corrected line after line, her mind working like a scalpel, precise and fast. Then she heard a voice. Impressive. She turned to see Richard Coleman standing in the doorway, arms folded. You found the errors. Zoe nodded. These translations could have derailed everything. One wrong word in Mandarin can carry weight most people don't understand. These are business elites. Cultural precision is everything. Who did the original translations? She looked up, hesitated. The language service listed in the files is a third-party contractor, but I looked up their business registration. It's run by someone named Ashley Whitmore. Coleman's face darkened. Related, niece of Thomas Whitmore. Director of Operations. Zoe paused. She doesn't hold any certifications in Mandarin. I cross-checked with the official registry. Her credentials are fake. Coleman exhaled slowly, his voice low. And we paid them $50,000 for this. Zoe handed him the corrected version. I fixed what I could. But I'd recommend we replace all Mandarin material before morning. He took the binder and scanned the pages, then looked at her again, really looked. You just saved this conference, and maybe this company. Zoe didn't reply. She didn't need to. The next day, the Grand Plaza's main ballroom pulsed with polished grandeur. Silk banners hung above floral arrangements. Name cards in English, Dutch, and Mandarin waited neatly at each seat. Zoe stood off to the side, dressed in an elegant navy blouse and tailored slacks. She didn't speak unless spoken to. But when she did, it was always in the right language at the right moment. One of the Dutch executives approached her with a soft smile. Are you the one who coordinated the language protocols? Zoe nodded politely. You speak like a native. I thought you were from The Hague. She smiled, born in Atlanta. But I learned Dutch for fun in college. The man laughed, shaking her hand with genuine warmth. By midday, Zoe was floating from table to table, mediating between cultures, smoothing over linguistic gaps, catching miscommunications before they unraveled. Executives who had barely looked her way earlier were now listening intently. She didn't just translate words, she interpreted meaning. She built bridges, but not everyone was applauding. Thomas Whitmore, the director of operations, stood at the edge of the ballroom like a statue. His eyes followed her every move. Later that afternoon, as guests enjoyed their catered lunch, he approached her near the back hallway. Miss Johnson. Quite the performance out there. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Richards tells me you've been helpful. Good to see our internal talent stepping up. Zoe didn't flinch. It's unfortunate no one noticed my resume listed fluency in Mandarin 6 years ago, especially considering we spent 50,000 on translations that nearly insulted a room full of executives. Whitmore's jaw tensed. There must have been a mistake. I'll have to review our hiring process. Zoe nodded calmly. I've already started, with Mr. Coleman's approval. For a split second, he froze. Then he forced another smile. Keep up the good work. He turned and walked away, his stride clipped and tight. What he didn't know was that Zoe already had a copy of the original translation contract. She had seen the inflated rates. She had matched them to the company tied to his niece. And she had collected the emails, the ones where real certified translators were rejected in favor of in-house options. This wasn't just carelessness, it was corruption. And now someone was watching, someone with a voice. Zoe returned to the conference room, adjusted the Dutch English signage on the main stage, and waited quietly as the next panel began. Outside, New York bustled with its usual noise. But inside the Grand Plaza, something deeper was shifting. For the first time, someone who had been silenced was being heard, and she wasn't going to whisper anymore. Racist hiring system exposed, black woman confronts the boss. The glow of the city faded behind Zoe's back as she stepped into the HR records room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile brightness on metal filing cabinets and sleek desktop monitors. But beneath that white light, secrets long buried in shadows were waiting to be found. Zoe wasn't alone. Seated beside her was Zoe Williams, the new recruitment analyst. Young, sharp, and just 3 months into the job, she had become Zoe Johnson's unexpected ally. Someone who didn't just see a maid with a degree, but saw a woman who'd been buried under silence. I pulled your personnel file on my first week, Williams said softly, and I couldn't understand how it sat untouched for 6 years. They leaned over spreadsheets, timelines, and transfer logs. The patterns were unmistakable. Over the past 5 years, dozens of qualified applicants, Black, Latino, Asian, mostly women, had been denied promotions or internal transfers. Meanwhile, candidates with fewer credentials but stronger connections sailed through the system. Zoe traced her finger across one chart. Look at that. Every internal resume flagged for review later had the same demographic profile. Williams shook her head. It's not accidental. This is structural. They dug deeper. Old emails, rejected applications, overwritten notes in HR software, and the translation contracts, those confirmed it all. Not only had Ashley Whitmore been unqualified, she'd been paid triple the market rate. It was theft disguised as business, prejudice dressed up as policy. Zoe gathered the documents in a slim black binder, her hands steady. She wasn't just building a case, she was building a reckoning. By the time she entered Richard Coleman's office later that day, the sky outside had turned gold. Coleman looked up from his desk, sensing something different in her posture. This wasn't another update. This was confrontation. She set the binder down without a word. He opened it. Page by page, his expression shifted from interest to fury. Hiring records, emails, side-by-side resumes showing minority candidates passed over for white employees with weaker qualifications. Payment receipts for inflated contracts. Proof that Whitmore had funneled tens of thousands of dollars to his niece's fake translation service while rejecting actual linguists already on staff. Zoe spoke quietly. This is what's been happening, not just to me, to a lot of people here. Coleman looked up. Are you sure? I am. Every file's been verified. Every document has a trace. I triple-checked it all. Before he could speak, the door opened. Thomas Whitmore stepped in, his voice brisk. Richard, the Dutch team is ready to sign, but they're asking about some inconsistencies in the translation files. Johnson must have mixed something up. Coleman didn't answer. He rose slowly, closing the binder. Thomas, I have payment records here showing $50,000 to a translation firm owned by your niece. A firm with no verified credentials. Meanwhile, multilingual employees like Ms. Johnson were cleaning bathrooms. Whitmore's eyes darted to Zoe, then back to Coleman. That's not true. We hire the best. Ashley studied at Peking University. Yes, Zoe pulled out a printed email. I contacted them directly. They've never issued a certificate to Ashley Whitmore. Not in Mandarin, not in any language. Whitmore's face turned crimson. You think this maid has the right to question? Dr. Zoe corrected. Dr. Zoe Johnson. Ph.D. in Applied Linguistics. 6 peer-reviewed publications, fluent in 6 languages, and my qualifications have been in this hotel's files since the day I started. Coleman's voice cut the room. Enough. I've seen all I need to see. He picked up the intercom. Assemble the board, emergency session. Now, 30 minutes later, the executive auditorium filled with tension. Every manager, every supervisor. Department heads lined the rows like schoolchildren waiting for judgment. At the front, the Dutch and Chinese executives sat quietly, observing. Coleman stood at the center of the stage. Next to him stood Zoe. Today, we reveal a pattern of discrimination, nepotism, and misconduct that has cost this company millions. And worse, it has cost us integrity. The screen behind them lit up with charts, racial and gender disparities in hiring. Resumes with redacted names shown side by side. Zoe's file denied 47 times. Contracts paid to family members of executives. Gasps rippled through the room. Zoe Johnson, the woman many of you knew only as a cleaning staff member, saved us from a diplomatic disaster this week. She exposed a system that was never meant to recognize her, but she did more than speak up. She rebuilt what others had broken. Whitmore sat frozen in the front row. His mouth opened, then closed. Mr. Whitmore has been terminated for cause. Ms. Richards is under investigation. Effective immediately, we are launching a full audit of all internal promotions and vendor contracts across all Grand Plaza locations. Applause broke out in the back, hesitant at first, then stronger. The cleaning crew, seated along the wall, stood to clap through tears. Zoe kept her eyes steady. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She had already cried for 6 years. Now she stood in the light, and the truth stood with her. Justice restored, Black woman becomes Global Communications Director. The auditorium fell silent after the final slide faded into black. On the stage, Richard Coleman looked across the room. His voice dropped to a deliberate calm, each word striking with the weight of justice. Effective immediately, Thomas Whitmore is terminated for cause. Sarah Richards is placed on indefinite suspension pending further investigation. Murmurs stirred among the managers seated in neat rows. But in the back, where the housekeeping crew huddled quietly, still in uniforms and name tags, silence turned into stillness. Hands rose to mouths. Eyes widened, and that's not all. Coleman turned slightly, motioning for someone to step forward. Today, I am proud to announce a new role. A role that should have existed long ago. A voice that should never have been ignored. I am appointing Dr. Zoe Johnson as our new Global Director of Multicultural Communications. She will oversee all language services, cultural training, and international protocol development across our hotels worldwide. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Zoe stepped forward into the soft light. Her blazer crisp, her chin lifted, but her eyes carried 6 years of being overlooked. And in them now was something fuller, something final. She took a breath, looked at the rows of faces before her, some embarrassed, some relieved, and then in the back her people, the overlooked, the silent, the ones who had trained themselves not to be seen. She spoke slowly, with the steadiness of someone who had waited too long to be heard. When I was little, my mother worked in a hotel just like this. She had a college degree but cleaned rooms because no one would hire her to do anything else. Her voice cracked just slightly. She didn't fight it. She used to tell me, Zoe, even if they don't see you, you still matter. Your value doesn't come from their recognition. It comes from your truth. She paused. She never lived to see this moment, but I know she's watching now. In the back of the room, an older janitor wiped his eyes. A dishwasher clapped slowly, then faster. The applause spread, raw, uneven, human. Cleaning staff, kitchen aides, maintenance men, people who had never been named in meetings, now stood and clapped with trembling hands. Zoe nodded to them, her eyes brimming. This promotion isn't just about me. It's about every resume that got tossed, every voice that was silenced, every person who has ever been told they were too much or not enough. We're not invisible, not anymore. Coleman stepped beside her, quiet. There will be new policies, full audits of every hiring and promotion decision over the last 5 years. And Dr. Johnson will be leading the charge. As the crowd slowly rose to their feet, Zoe looked out into the sea of faces and saw, for the first time, no pity. No dismissal, just recognition, respect. It was never just a job, it was never just a mistake in translation. It was a door. And now it was wide open. From cleaning floors to changing systems, the silent revolution begins. The city pulsed below like a sleeping giant. From the 32nd floor, the chaos of Manhattan looked almost peaceful. Zoe sat behind a glass desk in an office lined with quiet elegance, no longer hidden in the shadows of hotel corridors, but centered in the very heartbeat of leadership. Behind her, sunlight spilled across the words engraved in a bronze plaque, Dr. Zoe Johnson, Vice President of Diversity and Global Communications. It had been 6 months since she answered that phone call in Dutch. Now she led a program that was rewriting the DNA of the hotel industry. The screen before her flickered with the latest dashboard updates from the Invisible Talents Initiative. Her brainchild, her battleground, her legacy. In 6 months, they had identified 147 employees across the hotel chain with skills far beyond their roles. Former janitors with degrees in accounting. Line cooks fluent in Japanese. Front desk clerks with backgrounds in digital marketing. 83% of them were Black, Latino, or from other marginalized communities. Most had never even been considered for internal growth before, and now they were leading. Zoe looked up from the numbers as her executive assistant knocked lightly on the door. "They're ready for you. All regional managers are on the call. Coleman's already in the boardroom." Zoe stood, her navy suit tailored to fit the woman she had become. But her steps, her heart, were still rooted in who she had always been, the girl whose mother whispered affirmations in the hallway of a motel room after her second rejection letter. The conference room lights dimmed as her presentation began. Over the past 6 months, internal promotions have increased by 62%. Outsourced translation costs are down by 78%. International guest satisfaction is at an all-time high. But more important than numbers, we've built a new foundation. One where talent is no longer judged by zip code, accent, or skin tone. Managers nodded, some scribbled notes. Others just watched her, realizing this wasn't a trend. This was transformation. Zoe closed her presentation with a final slide. A black and white photo of her mother in a housekeeping uniform holding toddler Zoe on her hip. She turned toward the camera, streaming the meeting chain-wide. When I was 10, I watched my mother scrub a marble floor for someone who wouldn't say her name. She told me, never let them shrink you down to what makes them comfortable. Her voice softened. She passed away believing that doors like this would always be locked for people like us. I wish she could see them now. Across the country, employees watching from break rooms and service tunnels stood in silence, many with tears in their eyes. Later that afternoon, a white envelope was slid across Zoe's desk. It was postmarked from Amsterdam. Inside, a handwritten note on university letterhead, Dr. Johnson. "We've followed your work with awe. The department would be honored to have you join us as a visiting professor of intercultural linguistics. Sincerely, Professor Van Houten, University of Amsterdam." Zoe held the letter gently, her hands trembling. She looked out at the city once more, then whispered to herself, "If Richards had just given me a warning that day, I'd probably still be mopping floors." She smiled, eyes wet with gratitude and quiet pride. The next morning, she announced a new scholarship fund. It would pay full tuition for the children of hotel staff, maids, cooks, bellhops, those who had been overlooked too long. The first recipient, a shy, soft-spoken girl named Layla, daughter of the janitor who once taught Zoe how to use the industrial buffer machine on her first day. True justice, Zoe had learned, isn't just about punishing the powerful. It's about reaching back for the people who were never supposed to rise and making sure they do. Because every system that ignored her had helped build her. And now she was rebuilding the system, one voice, one name, one invisible talent at a time. Sometimes the most extraordinary revolutions begin in silence, in a whispered phone call, in a quiet act of integrity, in the unshakable belief that we are more than what the world allows us to be. Zoe's story is not just about one woman rising, it's about every overlooked soul who kept showing up, even when no one seemed to care. Let this be a reminder. Justice is not only about exposing what's wrong. It's about lifting up what was right all along. True change begins when we see the invisible, hear the unheard, and believe in those the world too often forgets. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments. What did Zoe's journey make you feel? What doors still need to be opened where you live? And don't go far. In the next videos, we'll bring you more untold stories of Black resilience, stories of injustice, triumph, and quiet power you've likely never heard before. These are the stories that challenge us, teach us, and remind us of the strength it takes not just to survive, but to rise.